I know you. You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.
You're that jaywalking punk anarchist. Jaywalking punk anarchist.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer, taking a look at Rules for Radicals, a pragmatic primer for realistic radicals, by Saul Alinsky, Vintage Books, 1971. Some of you have heard of this book as a handbook for political organization. Others have heard of this as an evil book.
A play called The Love Song of Saul Alinsky. And although the main attraction of the night was the performance honoring the life and the times of left-wing radical Saul Alinsky, the post-game show included a real panel discussion featuring Senator, well, they said Barack Obama, but it was Barack Obama, as well as some of Alinsky's closest friends, and even, yes, a handful of communist sympathizers.
Wow, seems like Saul Alinsky is out to destroy Mom, God, and apple pie. But let's look at what this book is really about. Well, the key idea of this text is to be a practical guide on how to organize people for effective change. This book provides information on how to help organize a community, how to galvanize this organized community into action, and how to plan and implement that action. Let's take a look at the text in depth. Prologue. To start us off, Alinsky argues that in order to work with other people, we have to be approachable and personable. He states, "My thing, if I want to organize, is solid communication with the people in the community." He argues that if we make ourselves unapproachable, then we likely want to be rejected as an excuse for poor cooperation. Or as Michael Albert states,
now, am I saying that every person on the left has to be religious, sports fanatic, and into TV, in a profoundly way so they can talk? No, I'm not saying that. But notice what the reality is. It isn't that, I'm not saying every person has to. I'm saying look around. Nobody is. Right? It's not just personal preferences. It's a style. Right? And it's a style that is destructive of our capacity to reach out.
Now, many authors have seen the middle class as reactionary. I've discussed this in other reviews, but Alinsky has this to say. If we fail to communicate with them, if we don't encourage them to form alliances with us, they will move to the right. Maybe they will anyway, but let's not let this happen by default. But we must go further than being approachable. Alinsky argues that we must sacrifice. He states, "People cannot be free unless they are willing to sacrifice some of their interests to guarantee the freedom of others."
Pacifism, and any doctrine that I'm aware of that will withstand scrutiny and is worthy of the name, holds that one shall not inflict violence. It says nothing about one will not absorb it. It says nothing about pacifism is synonymous with avoidance of risk. It says nothing about pacifism is synonymous with avoidance of sacrifice.
Chapter 1. The Purpose. This chapter is obviously about laying out the purpose of the book. Alinsky explains, "The Prince was written by Machiavelli for the haves on how to hold power. Rules for Radicals is written for the have-nots on how to take it away. Or perhaps more accurately, how to take it back." Alinsky then explains that this book is without a political leaning, and can be used by anyone without power to have an impact on those with power, stating, "This is a major reason for my attempt to provide a revolutionary handbook not cast in a communist or capitalist mold, but as a manual for the have-nots of the world regardless of the color of their skin or their politics. Essentially, if you are the weaker or less advantaged group in a disagreement, this text is a guide to getting your voice heard." What do you think, Radian?
Well, this part might seem odd, but we need to look at the context surrounding this book. This book was written in the early 70s, when the Eastern Bloc was still a thing. By framing the book as he did, Alinsky sidesteps the geopolitics while still working in a mostly Marxian class analysis framework. This may have made some sense in his time, but now the Cold War is over, and liberals have attempted to co-opt this book. This aspect of the book hasn't aged well, and this book works a lot better if you replace haves and have-nots with capitalists and workers. Alinsky continues, "The basic requirement for the understanding of the politics of change is to recognize the world as it is. We must work with it on its terms. Or as Marx states, To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions.
Chapter 2 of Means and Ends. This chapter takes a critical look at the arguments used to justify inaction or make action ineffective. Firstly, Alinsky argues, action is for mass salvation and not for individuals' personal salvation. He who sacrifices the mass good for his personal conscience has a particular concept of personal salvation. He doesn't care enough for people to be corrupted for them. Alinsky then gives 11 rules of the ethics of means versus ends. For example, the 6th rule is, the less important the ends to be desired, the more one can afford to engage in ethical evaluations of means. That is to say, when winning doesn't matter to you, it's easy for a person to say direct action is unethical, property destruction is unethical, blocking the roads is unethical, but if you want to win, you do what it takes to win. And the 9th rule is that any effective means are automatically considered unethical by its opponents. We see this all the time. The Black Panthers were called violent thugs, the Occupy movement was called lazy, dirty kids who were hurting local businesses, football players kneeling for the anthem is seen as inappropriate and disrespecting the troops, etc., etc. Alinsky ends the chapter arguing that the kind of means selected and how they can be used is significantly dependent upon the face of the enemy, or character of his opposition. Chris Hedges has made the same point, stating that those in power decide what means will be adopted. For example, when the Occupy movement's pacifism was met with violent police crackdown, the state essentially told the movement that their means of protest was not going to be effective and different means need to be used.
I think it is important to point out that Alinsky is not arguing that the ends always justify the means, but that you rarely have the luxury of having several possible means to pick from. Oftentimes, for radical movements, the ends that they are seeking is simply survival. But, as you said earlier, the opposition will always consider any effective means as immoral. One way they do this is by accusing you of believing the ends always justify the means when you don't believe this.
Chapter 4, The Education of an Organizer. This chapter is about what it means to be an effective organizer. Alinsky explains that an organizer can communicate only within the areas of experience of his audience. Essentially, this works two ways. A, you can't organize people around a problem that is irrelevant to them, and B, if you try to address a problem without talking to the people it's affecting, you will be lost. Alinsky then gives a list of 10 ideal elements an organizer should have. For example, curiosity, irreverence, imagination, and humor. Of humor, Alinsky states, humor is essential to a successful tactician, for the most potent weapons known to mankind are satire and ridicule. Look at who seems to be the most effective at educating and galvanizing support. Those who can point to their opponent and make them look like an ass. I mean, on YouTube, for example, if political opponents are frustratingly making responses to your work, you're probably on the right track. Chapter 6, In the Beginning. This chapter is about what to do before organizing, such as establishing your purpose and goals. Alinsky explains that power has the benefit of writing and owning the dominant narrative. He states, power means strength, whereas love is a human frailty the people mistrust. It is a sad fact of life that power and fear are the fountainheads of faith. Essentially, Alinsky is arguing that if you try to organize everyone around how much you love them, they will find you suspicious. However, if you come from their perspective and condemn their oppressors and demonstrate good faith for their cause, they will welcome your help because you are recognizing what is hurting them. Alinsky then explains that an organizer wants to quell people's anxieties about organizing, and one way to do this is the organizer serves as a protective shield. If anything goes wrong, it is all his fault. He has the responsibility. If they are successful, all the credit goes to the local people. Alinsky then reminds us of the key idea behind any action, stating, every move revolves around one central point. How many recruits will this bring into the organization? If by losing in a certain action he can get more members than by winning, then victory lies in losing, and he will lose. Now, this may seem odd, perhaps even dishonest, but remember earlier in the text? Action is for mass salvation and not for the individual's personal salvation. He who sacrifices the mass good for his personal conscience has a peculiar conception of personal salvation. The fact is that those in power will use whatever means necessary to win. Perhaps it is as simple as denying permits and putting out riot cops. Perhaps it is as malicious as false arrests, bombings, and assassinations, as have been done before, during, and after the COINTELPRO years. Under such circumstances, considerations like this make perfect sense. Lastly, Alinsky warns that within the movement, the individual is primary, because we must avoid the instinct to tell others what we think is best for them. Because when we do that, we are no longer giving to the community, we are taking away. Chapter 7. Tactics. This chapter is about what actions the organizer will take. Notice the chapter does not encourage picket signs, candlelight vigils, sit-ins, etc. Not that these tactics can't work, but because tactics are chosen in regards to the situation, rather than predictably and ineffectively applying the same tactics to all situations, as we've seen time and time again. Alinsky starts the chapter by defining tactics, stating, "Tactics means doing what you can with what you have. In the world of give and take, tactics is the art of how to take and how to give." Alinsky then lays out 13 rules of power tactics. For example, the second rule is never go outside the experience of your people. The third rule is, whenever possible, go outside the experience of the enemy. This is because you want your people to feel confident and comfortable in their action, and yet you want your opponent to feel unfamiliar and awkward. The fourth rule is, make the enemy live up to their own book of rules. The fifth rule, ridicule is man's most potent weapon. And the 13th rule, pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. Alinsky argues that it is important to attack a person because positions or offices or corporations can be changed and shift responsibility, and so you must attack the person and not the position. Alinsky then gives several examples of these tactics in action. One action Alinsky participated in had people occupy airport bathrooms, blocking their use. This works because it goes outside the experience of the enemy.
This isn't your standard picket line or sit-in.
This is within the experience of the organization.
People using the bathroom.
The tactic is fun and funny.
People hanging out, being silly, blocking a bathroom.
And the tactic ridicules those in power.
Because people in nice suits aren't supposed to be squirming around in their pants.
The airline didn't know what hit them and who was doing it. They were desperate to make it stop and to meet with someone from the organization to find out what to do. The action was successful. Alinsky warns that once a specific tactic is used, it ceases to be outside the experience of the enemy.
Well, the ruling class kind of notices when they fucked up. And they have lots of meetings saying, how did we fuck up? And the National Security Council rings up the head of the FBI and said, you fucked up. And the head of the FBI says to the head of the Red Squad, or the Anti-Terrorist Squad, or whatever they call it, you fucked up. And the guy in the Red Squad rings up the guy in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, and said, how did you fuck up? And so down the chain of command it goes. And the message is, don't fuck up next time.
It seems pretty obvious that the standard marching around with picket signs protest we've been using for decades has lost its impact. Alinsky also explains that organizers need to be flexible. You may have a detailed plan of action, but the reaction to your action can be unpredictable. You must be able to adapt your tactics at a moment's notice. And finally, Chapter 9, The Way Ahead. This chapter ends the text and addresses apathy and who needs to be organized. Alinsky starts the chapter by defining and explaining the middle class, similar to the ways that Barbara Ehrenreich does in Fear of Falling, and Chris Hedges does in Death of the Liberal Class, and hell, as Marx and Engels do in the Communist Manifesto. Namely, that the middle class has unfulfilled dreams, meaningless jobs, and fears losing what little security and enjoyments they have. And so, they are reactionary and strike out against the poor, the minorities, the unions, and whoever else corporate news and corporate talk radio tell them to hate. Alinsky calls on radicals to engage with these folks, stating, "The middle classes are numb. bewildered, scared into silence. They don't know what, if anything, they can do. This is the job of today's radicals, to fan the embers of hopelessness into a flame to fight. Alinsky argues that we must engage with this large group of people and mobilize them for change, rather than judge them or ignore them. As we've seen, if we ignore the suffering of lower middle class and working class white males, rather than bringing them into the fold, there are other unsavory groups that will gladly take them in. Conclusion. Before coming to this book, I was aware that COINTELPRO Action fought to crush the political movements of the past. I watched as the Iraq War protests and the Occupy movement spread all over the world to no effect. I saw modern political action as piecemeal, ineffective, and burning out its participants and pacifying the public. Radical action must not be confined to standing with a picket sign until you're told to go home. Instead, adopting the lessons of Rules for Radicals, we can work beyond apathy or reactionary violence and build organizations and actions that are varied, unexpected, imaginative, and fun. Political action that will truly change this system. Is there anything you would like to add, Radian?
Yeah, this text is focused on tactics that can be used against an oppressive system, which is great. However, as a handbook for radicals, I think that it is odd that it doesn't cover two important ideas: mutual aid and prefigurative politics. Mutual aid means the organization itself has some means for helping other members. An example of mutual aid is the Black Panthers Breakfast Program, which provided free breakfast to children. This sort of tactic, while not directly going after systems of oppression, builds members and solidarity in an organization. Prefigurative politics can be summed up as building the future world you wish to see inside of the shell of the old. This means that making sure the organization itself meets the standards you hold for the system you are organizing against. If you want power to the people, your organization should be horizontal to reflect this. Keeping this in mind allows you to have a more concrete understanding of what your ends should be. The additions of mutual aid and prefigurative politics rounds out the tool belt found in Rules for Radicals.
Yeah, good point. Alinsky doesn't really discuss how an organization should be structured, and you're right, mutual aid is oddly missing as well. Although this text is an important read for radicals, an informed activist should understand prefigurative politics and mutual aid as well. If you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical book reviews here with the Radical Reviewer.
And my channel is Radian2Pi. My main project has been summarizing Marx's Das Kapital in my video series Marxian Economics Made Easy.
Yeah, I found your breakdown and visuals of the mathematics of capital very helpful when it comes to understanding such a daunting text. I also like your video, Why Liberalism Decays into Fascism. And thank you for helping me with my review today. And to you viewers, thanks for watching.